Imagine two massive multinational corporations, right? And they completely dominate a global market.
Just a total duopoly.
Exactly. And they have like every incentive in the world to just sit down, work together, and make billions in guaranteed stable profit. They know exactly how to do it.
Right. The math is staring them right in the face.
Yeah. Yet pure mathematical logic practically guarantees that they are eventually going to betray each other, start this ruinous price war, and just, obliterate their own profit margins.
It's kind of wild. It is a world where rationality often leads to, well, mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and navigating that exact dynamic is precisely what we are here to do today. So, welcome to this deep dive. We've custom-tailored this directly for you, the listener.
Because we know you're in the trenches right now.
Oh, absolutely. Prepping for the IES General Economics GE-01, Paper 2, at the DSE or JNU Masters level. This is like your ultimate revision session.
We are stripping away all the external noise today.
Just focusing exclusively on the theory of value, so market structures, pricing, and game theory. Our mission here is to move beyond just memorizing definitions. We want to truly understand the mechanisms, how do these models actually work, both geometrically and behaviorally?
And we really need to jump straight into the deep end here because, if you look at the 2025 IES questions, the examiners are not pulling punches.
Yeah, they are no.
They are testing the absolute limits of your understanding of strategic interdependence.
I actually have those 2025 questions right here, and they really serve as the perfect intellectual stage for our discussion. So the examiners asked two massive questions that capture this complexity perfectly.
Right.
First, they asked how conjectural variations determine an oligopoly equilibrium, meaning, how does a firm make a strategic move based entirely on how it assumes its rivals will react to that specific move?
Which creates this infinite psychological loop, right? The whole I think that you think that I think thing, which we somehow have to translate into hard calculus.
Yeah, exactly. And then second, they asked about the stability of the Nash equilibrium in price competition, specifically referencing the Bertrand model. It's really clear they want to know if you can explain why firms trap themselves in these zero profit outcomes.
Those are just brilliant, rigorous questions.
Yeah.
But to truly analyze these complex games, where firms are desperately trying to outmaneuver each other, we first have to understand the absolute baseline.
Right.
Before we can understand how firms use market power, we need to know what a market looks like when firms have absolutely zero power to strategize at all.
The ground floor. Perfect competition.
Exactly.
Now, I look at perfect competition and I always think, isn't this just an imaginary utopia? It feels like the physicists', frictionless vacuum or the perfectly spherical cow.
Right, yeah.
It's incredibly useful for writing elegant math equations on a chalkboard, sure, but does it actually help us understand real-world markets where everyone is constantly trying to get an edge?
Well, that is the classic entirely valid critique, right? You will rarely, if ever, find a perfectly competitive market in reality.
Like maybe agriculture.
Yeah, agricultural commodities like wheat or soybeans might come close, but even then, it's not perfect. But we don't study perfect competition because it's realistic. We study it because it is the ultimate benchmark of economic efficiency.
Oh, I see.
It gives us the mathematical guarantee of what a perfectly healthy market looks like. That way we can measure the disease or inefficiency in every other market structure.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's break down the mechanics of that benchmark. In perfect competition, we are dealing with a market where there are so many buyers and sellers, and the product is so flawlessly homogeneous, meaning every single grain of wheat is identical to every other grain, that no single firm can influence the price.
Right. They're pure price takers.
Pure price takers.
The firm looks at the broader market, sees the going equilibrium price that's established by aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and they simply accept it.
Wow.
Their individual demand curve is just perfectly horizontal, perfectly elastic, right at that market price.
So let's walk through the dynamic adjustment between the short run and the long run, because I feel like that's where the real mechanism of perfect competition reveals itself.
Definitely.
What happens if, in the short run, the market price just happens to be really high?
Well, in the short run, a firm produces at the quantity where its marginal cost intersects that horizontal price line. And if that market price happens to be sitting above the firm's average total cost curve, the firm is making supernormal profits.
Right. They are earning a surplus above and beyond their implicit costs.
Exactly, including the opportunity cost of their capital.
But this is where the core mechanism kicks in, right? Because perfect competition assumes perfect information and absolutely no barriers to entry. So that supernormal profit doesn't stay a secret for long.
Not at all. It acts like a massive beacon.
A beacon attracting capital from outside the industry.
Yep. Entrepreneurs and investors see those supernormal profits, and they just immediately enter the market. And as hundreds or thousands of new firms enter, they each bring their own production to the table.
So the aggregate industry supply curve physically shifts to the right.
Precisely. And as you shift that industry supply curve to the right against a standard downward-sloping market demand curve, well, the intersection point has to move down.
The market price drops.
It has to drop.
It's basically a self-correcting mechanism. Like the high profits cause the entry causes the supply increase causes the price drop, and the price drop eventually just suffocates the very profits that started the whole cycle.
It drops until that supernormal profit is entirely squeezed out of the system.
Wow.
The entry of new firms only stops when economic profit reaches exactly zero. At this point, the market has settled into its long-run equilibrium. And for the exam, it is vital that you can state this condition with absolute mathematical precision.
Okay, I want to make sure I have the sequence exactly right in my head.
So in long-run perfect competition, price equals marginal revenue, which equals marginal cost, which equals minimum average cost.
Let's dissect that, because there is like a lot of economic welfare packed into that one little sequence. Price equals marginal cost is allocative efficiency, right?
Yes.
It means the value society places on the very last unit produced, the price they are willing to pay for it, is exactly equal to the cost of the resources required to produce it. Nobody is being shortchanged.
Correct. We are producing exactly what society wants in the exact quantities they want it.
And the second part, the equals minimum average cost part.
That represents productive efficiency. It means survival in this market actually requires firms to operate at the absolute lowest point on their U-shaped average cost curve.
Oh, right, because if they don't, they're losing money at the new lower price.
Exactly. Any firm that is bloated, inefficient, or operating with excess capacity simply will not survive those price drops.
Okay, so the firm's short-run supply curve is just its marginal cost curve, but only a specific portion of it, correct?
Yes, only the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the average variable cost curve.
Why is that?
Because if the market price falls below average variable cost, the firm can't even cover its day-to-day operating expenses, things like, hourly labor and raw materials.
Right.
In that scenario, the firm loses less money by simply shutting down production entirely and just paying its fixed costs. So the short-run supply curve starts exactly at that shutdown point.
Now, here's a concept from the sources that I think often trips people up. The firm has an upward-sloping short-run supply curve, but the industry's long-run supply curve can be completely different. The syllabus specifically mentions the derivation of the long-run supply curve for a constant cost industry. Why does that yield a perfectly horizontal line?
To visualize this, imagine the industry expanding rapidly due to those supernormal profits we just discussed.
Okay, hundreds of new factories are built.
Right. In a constant cost industry, we assume that this massive expansion doesn't fundamentally change the prices of the inputs the industry uses. For example, if pencil manufacturers double in number, they use such a tiny fraction of the world's lumber and graphite that their expansion doesn't actually bid up the price of wood or lead.
So their raw material costs stay flat, regardless of how big the industry gets.
Exactly, because input costs don't rise. The cost curves for every individual firm stay exactly where they are.
Right.
So when the new entry drives the market price back down to zero economic profit, it settles at the exact same minimum average cost as it did before the expansion.
Okay, I see it.
If you plot the old equilibrium price quantity point on a graph and then plot the new equilibrium point after the massive expansion, the price is identical. Connect those dots, and you get a perfectly flat, horizontal, long-run industry supply curve.
It just stretches out infinitely at that minimum average cost price. That makes perfect sense. So perfect competition is our yardstick. We measure how sick or inefficient a real-world market is by comparing it to this perfectly healthy, frictionless baseline.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads us to the exact opposite extreme. What happens when we completely strip away all those competitors? What happens when a single firm sucks all the oxygen out of the room, builds these insurmountable barriers to entry, and becomes the absolute price maker?
Then we enter the realm of monopoly pricing, and the rules of the game fundamentally change.
Right.
In perfect competition, the firm faces a horizontal demand curve. But under monopoly, the firm is the entire industry. Therefore, the entire downward-sloping market demand curve is the firm's individual demand curve.
And that downward slope changes the math completely, right? Because to sell one more unit of their product, the monopolists can't just keep charging the same high price. They have to lower the price.
Yes.
But here's the catch. They have to lower the price not just on that marginal unit, but on all the previous units they could have sold at a higher price.
That is the defining mechanism of monopoly pricing, because they must cut the price on inframarginal units to sell the marginal unit. The revenue they gain from selling one more unit, their marginal revenue, is always mathematically less than the price they charge.
So on a graph, the marginal revenue curve pulls away from the demand curve and falls twice as fast.
Exactly.
So if they aren't equating price to marginal cost anymore, like our perfect competitors did, how do they find their profit maximizing sweet spot?
They still follow the universal rule of profit maximization.
Right.
They produce exactly the quantity where their marginal revenue curve intersects their marginal cost curve.
Okay.
But crucially, they do not charge the price at that intersection. Once they find that optimal quantity, they draw a vertical line straight up from that intersection point to the demand curve.
Oh.
That tells them the absolute maximum price consumers are willing to pay for that specific restricted quantity.
They intentionally choke off supply to force the price up the demand curve. Now, this pricing power is deeply tied to the concept of elasticity. The sources mandate that we understand the exact mathematical relationship between price, marginal revenue, and the price elasticity of demand.
Yes, this relationship is a foundational proof for the IES exam, often referred to as the Amoroso-Robinson relation.
How exactly does that translate to spoken English?
Here is the exact translation of the formula. Monopoly prices where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Marginal revenue is less than price by an amount that depends on the elasticity of demand. Specifically, price times the quantity 1 minus 1 over the absolute elasticity equals marginal cost.
Let's translate that math into behavioral reality, because I really want to understand why the elasticity fraction matters so much.
Sure.
Let's say I have a monopoly on a life-saving drug, like a patented insulin. Demand is highly inelastic. Consumers have no alternative. They need the product to live. So that absolute elasticity number is very small, say close to 0.
Okay, let's follow the math. If elasticity is very small, say 0.5, then 1 over elasticity is a large number. But wait, a monopolist will never actually produce on the inelastic portion of the demand curve.
Wait, really? Why not?
Because if demand is inelastic, a price increase will actually increase total revenue while decreasing the quantity produced, which decreases total costs.
Oh, wow.
Profits would strictly increase. Therefore, a rational, profit-maximizing monopolist will just keep raising the price until they reach the elastic portion of the demand curve, where elasticity is greater than 1.
Okay, that is a brilliant nuance. So let's say elasticity is 1.5. Highly inelastic for a monopolist, but technically elastic.
If absolute elasticity is 1.5, then 1 over 1.5 is roughly 0.66. 1 minus 0.66 is 0.33. This means your marginal cost is only 33% of your price. Or, flipped around, your price is 3 times your marginal cost.
You are extracting a massive markup.
Exactly. Because the consumers are relatively insensitive to the price.
But what if I have a monopoly on like a specific non-essential luxury item where elasticity is much higher, say 10?
If elasticity is 10, then 1 over 10 is 0.1. 1 minus 0.1 is 0.9. Your marginal cost is 90% of your price. Your markup is incredibly thin. This mathematical relationship is the basis of the Lerner Index of monopoly power. It proves that a monopolist's power to mark up price over marginal cost is inversely proportional to the elasticity of demand.
That is perfectly clear. Now, let's tackle what might be the most counterintuitive concept in this entire section. This was a direct 25-mark question in the 2025 IES exam. Explain why a monopoly has no supply curve.
Right.
On the surface, that sounds absurd. They're literally the only supplier. How can the sole supplier not have a supply curve?
To understand this, we have to go back to the strict definition of what a supply curve actually is. In perfect competition, a supply curve provides a unique one-to-one mapping. For any given price thrown out by the market, the supply curve tells us the one specific quantity the firm will produce.
It's an independent relationship.
Exactly.
Right, like if the price is $10, I produce 50 units. If it's $12, I produce 60 units. It's a predictable schedule.
Exactly. But under a monopoly, that unique one-to-one mapping completely breaks down. The monopolist's decision isn't based just on price, it's based on marginal revenue, which is derived from the shape and elasticity of the demand curve.
Okay.
Because price and marginal revenue are decoupled, you can no longer connect a single price to a single quantity.
I need a geometric visualization of this to really grasp it. How exactly does the mapping break down?
Imagine a graph with a standard marginal cost curve. Now, draw a demand curve and its corresponding marginal revenue curve. The MR curve intersects the MC curve at, let's say, 100 units. You go straight up to the demand curve and the price is $50.
Got it.
Now imagine a totally different market scenario where consumer preferences change. The demand curve rotates, it becomes much steeper, much more inelastic.
Okay, so the MR curve changes its slope too.
Yes. And it is mathematically possible for this completely new MR curve to intersect the exact same marginal cost point at 100 units. So the monopolist still chooses to produce exactly 100 units. But when you go straight up to this new, steeper demand curve, the price might be $80.
Wow. So because the elasticity changed, the firm is supplying the exact same quantity of 100 units, but at two completely different prices, $50 and $80.
Precisely. And you could run the geometry in reverse, too.
Yeah.
You could have two different demand curves that result in the monopolist charging the exact same $50 price, but supplying two completely different quantities.
That's crazy.
Because the quantity supplied depends entirely on the elasticity of demand at any given moment, there is no independent relationship between price and quantity. Therefore, the concept of a monopoly supply curve evaporates. It simply does not exist.
That is a phenomenal conceptual trap to avoid on the exam. You can't just draw a rising line and label it monopoly supply.
Definitely not.
Now, we established earlier that perfect competition is perfectly efficient. Monopoly, by artificially restricting that output to force the price up, introduces a profound inefficiency into the market, the deadweight loss.
Often referred to graphically as the Harburger triangle. Because the monopolist stops producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, they intentionally leave mutually beneficial transactions completely unexploited.
Walk me through the welfare economics of that triangle. Who is losing what?
Between the monopoly quantity and the competitive quantity, the demand curve sits above the marginal cost curve. This physically means there are consumers who value the product more than it costs society to produce it.
Okay.
For example, the marginal cost to produce one more unit might be $20, and a consumer is willing to pay $30.
In a competitive market, that unit gets produced. The firm makes a profit, the consumer gets surplus value, everybody wins.
But the monopolist refuses to produce it, because to sell it to that consumer for $30, they would have to lower the price on all the thousands of units they are currently selling for $50. The lost revenue on the inframarginal units would far outweigh the $10 profit they make on the new transaction.
So they just leave that transaction on the table. The value is just destroyed. It isn't transferred from the consumer to the monopolist. It just vanishes from the economy into thin air. That's the deadweight loss. The literal triangle bounded by the demand curve, the marginal cost curve, and the vertical line of the restricted monopoly quantity.
Correct. It is a pure loss of social welfare. But, monopolists are exceptionally clever. They hate leaving money on the table.
Right.
If they could somehow find a way to charge that one consumer $30 without having to lower the price for the consumer paying $50, they could eliminate that deadweight loss entirely and capture all that phantom consumer surplus for themselves.
And that brings us to the holy grail of monopoly strategy, price discrimination. The art of charging different people different prices for the exact same product, not based on any difference in costs, but purely based on differences in their willingness to pay.
It's very common.
The sources break this down into 3 degrees. Let's start with the theoretical extreme.
First-degree price discrimination, also known as perfect price discrimination. This is where the monopolist knows the absolute maximum willingness to pay of every single consumer and charges each of them exactly that amount.
So if I'm willing to pay $100 for a pair of shoes, they charge me $100. If you were only willing to pay $60, they charge you $60.
Exactly. In this scenario, the marginal revenue curve actually becomes the demand curve because they don't have to lower the price on previous units to sell the next one. They will keep producing all the way down to where price equals marginal cost.
Wait, so perfect price discrimination completely eliminates the deadweight loss? It achieves perfectly efficient output?
Yes, it is allocatively efficient. However, the distribution of that welfare is completely skewed.
Because the firm takes it all.
Exactly. There is zero consumer surplus. The monopolist extracts absolutely 100% of the total social value as profit. It's efficient, but highly inequitable. It's also incredibly rare because acquiring that level of perfect information about every consumer is almost impossible.
Right. So they use proxies. What about the second degree?
Second-degree price discrimination is about self-selection through block pricing or quantity discounts.
Hmm.
The monopolist doesn't know who the high-demand or low-demand consumers are, so they offer a menu of prices.
Like buying in bulk.
Yeah, or think of electricity billing. The first 100 kilowatts cost hourly 15 cents per unit, the next 100 cost 10 falls, and so on. The price varies by the quantity consumed, and consumers sort themselves into the different blocks.
It extracts a chunk of consumer surplus, but not all of it. But the one the examiners love to test, because the math is so elegant, is third-degree price discrimination.
This is by far the most common in the real world. This is where the monopolist takes the total market and explicitly segments it into distinct, identifiable submarkets based on differing price elasticities of demand.
Okay.
They have to be able to prevent arbitrage, meaning they have to stop the people in the cheap market from buying the product and reselling it to the people in the expensive market.
So different groups have different sensitivities to price changes, and the monopolist exploits that difference. What is the mathematical condition for achieving equilibrium here? How do they decide how much to sell in each market?
The firm wants to maximize total profit across all segmented markets. To do this, they must allocate their total output such that the marginal revenue gain from the last unit sold in Market 1 is exactly equal to the marginal revenue gain from the last unit sold in Market 2.
Right.
And both of those marginal revenues must be equal to the firm's total marginal cost.
State the spoken formula for that, just to cement it for the listener.
Marginal revenue in Market 1 equals marginal revenue in Market 2, which equals marginal cost.
Okay, I need a concrete analogy to explain the mechanism behind this because it's brilliant. Let's look at pharmacies offering senior citizen discounts. For a long time, I honestly thought that was just corporate generosity or maybe just good community public relations.
A lot of people do.
But reading the economic literature, this is a ruthless application of strict third-degree price discrimination.
It is entirely profit-driven. Let's look at the two segments: senior citizens and working-age adults. Seniors are often living on fixed incomes, so a $20 increase in the price of a medication represents a massive hit to their monthly budget.
So their demand is highly elastic.
Exactly. If the price goes up, they might literally ration their pills or skip doses entirely. They are hypersensitive to price.
But the working-age adults,
Working adults, especially those with employer-sponsored health insurance, are highly inelastic. They don't look at the price tag, they just pay their copay and take the medication.
so if the pharmacy was forced to charge a single uniform price to everyone, they'd have a dilemma.
Right.
If they set the price high to extract money from the inelastic adults, the seniors are priced out and the pharmacy loses all that volume. But if they set the price low to keep the seniors buying, they are leaving a mountain of cash on the table from the adults who would have gladly paid more.
Precisely. So they enforce a barrier asking for a senior ID card and segment the market. They apply the inverse elasticity rule we discussed earlier. They charge the highly inelastic working adults an exorbitant price, and they charge the highly elastic seniors a much lower discounted price.
They are perfectly calibrating the markup in each market to extract the maximum possible consumer surplus from both groups simultaneously. It's fascinating how a mathematical optimization problem manifests as a discount at the register.
And that wraps the extremes. We've gone from the perfect efficiency of infinite competitors to the absolute dictatorship of a single monopolist.
But the real world is rarely that black and white, is it?
No, almost never.
What happens when you blend the two? What if you don't have a total monopoly, but you have a monopoly over a very specific, carefully branded slice of the market?
This is where we move into Edward Chamberlain's model of monopolistic competition. And I love this model because it describes almost everything we buy on a daily basis.
It is a beautiful theoretical synthesis. Chamberlain took the core characteristics of perfect competition. Specifically, there are many firms and absolutely free entry and exit into the industry. But he dropped the assumption of homogeneous products. He introduced product differentiation.
The illusion of uniqueness.
Yeah.
Every single firm is selling something slightly different. It might be different packaging, a different location, a slightly different flavor profile, or just highly effective marketing that creates perceived quality.
Exactly. Because your specific product is differentiated in the minds of consumers, you are no longer a price taker.
Right.
If you run a local artisan coffee shop and you raise the price of your signature latte by 50 cents, you don't instantly lose every single customer to the shop down the street. Some customers prefer your specific roast or the vibe of your cafe.
You have a mini monopoly over your loyal brand followers.
Mhm.
And because of that brand loyalty, your individual demand curve slopes downward, just like a pure monopolist.
You have some pricing power.
Yep. In the short run, you operate exactly like a monopolist. You set MR equal to MC, you charge a price up on your downward sloping demand curve, and if that price is above your average cost, you make supernormal profits.
But here comes the competitive half of the synthesis. The free entry part is the kicker. If you start making a killing selling your unique lavender-infused artisan coffee, you have no barriers to entry to protect you. 10 other entrepreneurs are going to lease storefronts on your exact same street and open their own artisan coffee shops.
And this is where the geometric mechanism is crucial to understand. As these new competitors enter, they offer close substitutes. This slowly drains your customer base. Geometrically, your specific individual downward sloping demand curve physically shifts to the left.
Because at any given price, you are now selling fewer lattes.
Exactly. And it keeps shifting left, eating further and further into your market share until a very specific mathematical condition is met. The entry only stops when your shifting demand curve becomes perfectly tangent to your average cost curve.
Because at that point of tangency, price exactly equals average cost. The supernormal profits have been entirely competed away. Economic profit is driven strictly to zero. Long-run equilibrium is achieved.
Yes, but there is a massive structural catch here, and the IES examiners love to test it. It's called the excess capacity theorem.
Walk me through the geometric proof of this theorem because it proves why this market structure is inherently inefficient.
Visualize the long-run equilibrium. You have a U-shaped average cost curve. You also have a downward sloping demand curve. For profits to be zero, the demand curve must touch the average cost curve at exactly one point. It must be tangent.
Okay.
Now, think about the geometry. It is mathematically impossible for a downward sloping straight line to be tangent to the flat horizontal minimum point at the very bottom of a U-shape.
Right. If it touches the bottom, it has to be a horizontal line, like in perfect competition.
Exactly. A downward sloping line can only be tangent to a U-shape on the segment where the U-shape is also sloping downward.
Meaning, the point of tangency, the firm's production quantity, happens physically to the left of the minimum average cost point.
Yes. The firm stops producing before it reaches its most efficient scale. This is the excess capacity. Firms in monopolistic competition chronically underproduce.
They're productively inefficient.
From a pure engineering or cost perspective, yes. They are building coffee shops that could serve 500 customers a day at minimum cost, but because they share the market with 50 other shops, they only serve 200 customers a day.
And because they are on the downward sloping part of the demand curve, the price they charge is still higher than their marginal cost. So they're allocatively inefficient too. There is a deadweight loss.
Yes, they exhibit both types of inefficiency.
Okay, I have to ask a philosophical economic question about this because this tension is highlighted in the texts. If excess capacity means we are both productively and allocatively inefficient, is it inherently a bad thing? Or is this mathematical inefficiency just the acceptable, necessary tax we pay for the benefit of having variety in our lives?
That's a great question.
Like, I could live in a perfectly competitive world where there is only one perfectly efficient, minimum cost, generic, government-issued nutrient powder, but I'd much rather live in a world with 50 inefficient brands of coffee, even if they all operate with little excess capacity.
That is the exact trade-off welfare economists debate.
Yeah.
You're perfectly describing the tension between static inefficiency, the mathematical waste of not producing at the absolute minimum cost, and dynamic consumer welfare.
Right.
Chamberlain himself argued that this isn't necessarily a waste. The difference between the ideal competitive output and the monopolistic output is essentially the cost of producing variety.
It's the cost of having choices.
Exactly. As long as consumers inherently value that variety and are willing to pay the slight markup to get the exact flavor or style they want, the market is serving a vital, utility-maximizing purpose. It's not a failure, it's a feature.
I love that perspective. It makes the inefficiency feel human. But when we strip away the illusion of endless unique brands, when we stop talking about coffee shops and start talking about commercial airlines or operating systems or global logistics industries dominated by just 2 or 3 massive players, the math gets significantly more aggressive.
And that brings us to the strategic chessboard of oligopoly models. We need to dedicate significant time here because numerical duopoly questions are an absolute staple of the IES exams. If you don't understand the underlying assumptions of these models, you cannot solve the equations.
Let's define the core tension. In perfect competition, you ignore your rivals because there are too many of them. In a monopoly, you ignore your rivals because they don't exist. But in an oligopoly, you have mutual interdependence.
You cannot make a single decision about price or quantity without explicitly factoring in what your specific rival will do in response. You are locked in a room together.
Let's start with the foundational contrast that defines this entire field. Augustin Cournot versus Joseph Bertrand. Two different French mathematicians, two totally different models of reality. Let's start with Cournot.
The Cournot duopoly model fundamentally assumes that firms compete on quantity. Imagine two firms producing an identical product. They must decide simultaneously exactly how much output to produce.
Okay.
They lock in their production, bring it all to the market, and the total aggregate supply determines the final market price based on the demand curve.
So Cournot is like two rival farmers deciding how many acres of wheat to plant before the season starts. They have to make their decision in the spring, in isolation. They plant the seeds, harvest the crop, and bring it all to the grain elevator in the fall. Whatever the combined massive pile of wheat is dictates the price for both of them.
That is an excellent analogy. Now, how does a firm decide how much to plant? They use a best response or reaction function. Firm 1 looks at the total market demand and makes an assumption about Firm 2.
What's the assumption?
Specifically, Firm 1 assumes that whatever output Firm 2 produced last time, Firm 2 will produce the exact same amount this time.
So Firm 1 subtracts Firm 2's assumed output from the total market demand. What's left over is Firm 1's residual demand curve?
Exactly. Firm 1 then acts like a monopolist over that residual demand curve, setting its own MR equal to MC to find its optimal quantity. But Firm 2 is doing the exact same mathematical calculus simultaneously, making an assumption about Firm 1.
So they are constantly reacting to each other. Firm 1 adjusts, which changes Firm 2's residual demand, so Firm 2 adjusts, which changes Firm 1's residual demand.
It creates a sequence of adjustments. Graphically, if you plot Firm 1's best response to every possible output of Firm 2, you get Firm 1's reaction curve. Do the same for Firm 2. The Cournot-Nash equilibrium is the exact coordinate where those two reaction curves intersect.
So at that precise intersection, both firms have accurately guessed the other's output, and neither firm has any incentive to change their production level. The market is stable.
They reach a stalemate. But Bertrand looked at that model and completely rejected it. Bertrand argued that in the real world, firms don't compete on quantity and let the market set the price. They compete on price directly and let the market determine the quantity they sell.
So they simultaneously set their prices. And because the products are perfectly identical, consumers being perfectly rational and having perfect information will flock entirely to whichever firm is even a fraction of a cent cheaper.
Yes. If Firm 1 charges $10 and Firm 2 charges $9.99, Firm 2 captures 100% of the entire market demand, and Firm 1 sells absolutely nothing.
Okay, my analogy for Bertrand, it's like two gas stations located right across the street from each other at an intersection. They sell identical fuel. They just stare at each other's giant neon signs all day. If Station A drops its price by a penny, every single car turns into Station A.
Station B's lot is entirely empty.
So what does Station B do? Station B panics and changes their sign to undercut Station A by another penny. Then Station A's lot is empty, so they undercut Station B. Because consumers are perfectly price sensitive, these two gas stations are trapped in a ruthless downward spiral. They are in a race to the bottom until they hit their wholesale cost of the gas.
And that leads to a shocking mathematical conclusion known as the Bertrand paradox. Let's state this clearly for the listener. In a pure Bertrand model, competing on price drives the equilibrium to where price equals marginal cost, resulting in zero economic profit, exactly like perfect competition, even with only two firms.
That is the paradox. You have an oligopoly. You have two massive, powerful firms that should be extracting huge profits. But because they are trapped in this specific structural dynamic of price undercutting, they completely obliterate their own profit margins down to the competitive floor. Two local monopolies effectively turn themselves into a hyper-competitive, zero-profit bloodbath.
It highlights how drastically the assumption of what you compete on price versus quantity changes the outcome. Now, both Cournot and Bertrand assume the firms make their decisions simultaneously. But what if the game isn't simultaneous? What if one firm gets to move first?
This introduces Heinrich von Stackelberg's leadership model, the sheer power of the first mover advantage.
In the Stackelberg model, one firm, the leader, commits to an output level first. It is observable and irreversible. The second firm, the follower, observes this output, accepts it as given, and then sets their own optimal response using the standard Cournot reaction function.
Why does moving first give you such a massive advantage? Why wouldn't the follower just aggressively overproduce anyway to punish the leader?
Because the game is solved through backward induction. The leader knows the follower is a rational profit maximizer. The leader knows the exact mathematical formula of the follower's reaction function. Therefore, the leader can literally plug the follower's reaction function directly into their own profit equation.
The leader essentially solves the follower's problem for them before they even act.
Exactly. Because the leader knows how the follower must react, the leader can strategically overproduce. They flood the market with quantity.
Great.
The follower, waking up and seeing the market already saturated, realizes that if they also produce a large quantity, the total supply will crash the market price below marginal cost, and they will both go bankrupt.
So the follower is rationally forced to shrink their output to accommodate the leader just to keep the price high enough to survive.
Precisely. The leader exploits the follower's rationality to steal a significantly larger market share and earn higher profits than they would under a simultaneous Cournot game. Strategic commitment has immense tangible value.
This perfectly tees up that 2025 exam question on conjectural variations. Hearing the word conjecture, it sounds like an umbrella term for all these different assumptions we've been talking about.
It is the formal mathematical term for it. A conjectural variation is essentially the explicit assumption a firm makes about how its rival will respond to a change in its own output. We assign it a mathematical value. In the Cournot model, the conjectural variation is exactly 0. I assume my rival will change their output by 0 units if I change mine.
They assume the rival is a statue.
Right. But if the conjectural variation is negative, say, -1, it means I expect my rival to perfectly offset my moves. If I decrease my output by 1 unit to raise the price, I assume my rival will aggressively increase their output by 1 unit to steal the market. This creates a highly competitive outcome.
What if the conjectural variation is positive?
A positive conjectural variation means I expect my rival to match my moves. If I cut my output to raise the price, I assume my rival will also cut their output to help raise the price. That is an assumption of collusion. By plugging different conjectural variation numbers into the calculus, you can derive every single market structure from perfect competition all the way to a pure monopoly cartel.
It's the unified field theory of oligopoly math. Now, speaking of assumptions about how rivals react, the exam specifically linked conjectural variations to explaining price stickiness via the kinked demand curve model. What is that anomaly?
This is Paul Sweezy's model. Economists noticed a real-world anomaly. In many oligopolies, even when the underlying costs of production fluctuate wildly like raw material costs spiking or plummeting, the firms stubbornly refuse to change their retail prices. The prices are sticky.
If costs go up for airlines, they raise ticket prices. But sometimes fuel costs fluctuate by 20% and the ticket prices stay completely frozen. Why?
Sweezy explained this using a highly specific asymmetrical conjectural variation. Imagine you are an oligopolist looking at your current price. You assume that if you cut your price, your rivals will instantly panic and match your price cut because they refuse to lose their market share to you.
So if I lower my price, I don't actually steal many customers because everyone else lowered their prices too. Therefore, demand for price decreases is highly inelastic. The curve is steep downward.
Exactly. But look at the other direction. You assume that if you raise your price, your rivals will gleefully ignore you. They will keep their prices low and steal all your customers who are fleeing your price hike.
So if I raise my price even a little bit, I lose massive volume. Therefore, demand for price increases is highly elastic. The curve is relatively flat upward.
When you join that flat elastic curve from above with the steep inelastic curve from below at the current market price, it creates a literal, sharp geometric kink in the demand curve.
And how does that kink explain the sticky prices when costs change?
Mathematically, a sharp kink in a demand curve creates a massive discontinuous vertical gap in the corresponding marginal revenue curve. The MR curve drops straight down like a cliff.
Oh, I see.
Because of this massive vertical gap, your marginal cost curve can shift up and down, significantly fluctuating wildly within that gap. And the MR equals MC intersection point will still dictate the exact same quantity and the exact same price.
That is brilliant geometry. The firm absorbs the cost shocks internally, rather than risking a price war or a mass exodus of customers. Prices remain perfectly stable despite the underlying volatility.
Yes. Now, let's explore one final oligopoly strategy, limit pricing. specifically the Bain-Silos-Modigliani model. We've talked about fighting rivals who are already in the market, but this model is about entry deterrence. It's about keeping new sharks out of the water entirely.
Imagine I'm an incumbent monopolist. I own the market. I could easily just set MR equal to MC, restrict my output, and charge the highest possible monopoly price.
You could, but that massive supernormal profit acts as that beacon we talked about earlier. It practically begs new entrants to try and break in your market to steal those profits.
So what is the Bain-Silos-Modigliani counter strategy?
The limit pricing model suggests that a rational incumbent will intentionally choose not to maximize their short-run profits. Instead, they produce a much higher output operating with intentional massive excess capacity and charge a lower price, known as a limit price.
Wait, I need to understand the psychology of this. Why would I intentionally lower my own profits and build factories I don't even need?
Because you are issuing a highly credible threat. The silos postulate assumes that potential entrants believe the incumbent will maintain their high output level even after the new firm enters.
Okay.
By maintaining this massive excess capacity, you are visually signaling to any potential entrant. Look at all these idle machines I have. If you dare cross the threshold into my market, I will turn them all on. I will flood the market with so much output that the post-entry price will crash. It will crash so far below your average cost that you will go bankrupt on your first day.
It's pure economic warfare. I am making the post-entry environment look so hostile, so utterly unprofitable, that the potential entrant looks at the math, gets terrified, and decides to invest their capital in a different industry. I sacrifice some short-term profit to guarantee my long-term monopoly survival.
Exactly. It's a strategic entry barrier built purely out of threatened overproduction.
But to actually mathematically prove these duopoly standoffs, to definitively model why firms make these choices about price wars, or collusion economists realize that standard supply and demand curves weren't powerful enough, they had to borrow a completely different analytical framework, largely developed by Cold War mathematicians analyzing nuclear deterrence. This brings us perfectly into the realm of game theory and the Nash equilibrium.
John Nash revolutionized how we analyze strategic interactions across all fields, but especially in oligopoly pricing. A Nash equilibrium is the cornerstone concept. It is formally defined as a stable state of a system involving the interaction of different participants, in which no participant can gain by a unilateral change of strategy, provided the strategies of the others remain unchanged.
So to put it simply, it's a state where everyone is playing their absolute best possible response to what everyone else is doing. There are no regrets. If you could go back in time, knowing what your opponent did, you wouldn't change your move.
Precisely. Let's walk the listener through the derivation of a Nash equilibrium in a simple 2x2 normal form game, because this is guaranteed points on the exam.
Let's make it vivid. Put me in a high-stakes scenario.
You are the CEO of Delta Airlines. Your only rival on the lucrative Atlanta to Chicago route is United Airlines. You both have a choice. You can either maintain a high price for tickets or trigger a price war and offer a low price. You are firm 1, you control the rows of the matrix. United is firm 2, they control the columns. Inside the 4 boxes are the profit payoffs. How do you find the Nash equilibrium?
I use the underline method. I assume United makes a move, and I find my best response. So I say, if United chooses the high price column, what is my best row? If I also choose high price, we split the market, I make $50 million. But if I undercut them and choose low price, I steal all their passengers and make $80 million. $80 is greater than $50, so I underline my $80 payoff in the low price row.
Correct. Now, what if United chooses the low price column?
If they go low, and I stubbornly stay high price, my planes fly empty, I make $0. If I also go low price, we split the low revenue market, and I make $20 million. $20 is better than 0, so I underline the $20 payoff in the low price row.
Now, United does the exact same calculation from their perspective, comparing the columns against your chosen rows. They underline their best responses.
And the mechanical rule is, any box in the matrix that has both payoffs underlined is a Nash equilibrium. It means both CEOs are simultaneously playing their best response to the other. Neither has any incentive to unilaterally deviate.
Exactly. Now, the specific scenario you just mapped out is the most famous game in economics, the prisoner's dilemma. And its application to duopolies and cartels is profound and devastating.
Let's apply it to a cartel. Imagine Delta and United secretly meet in a smoke-filled room. They agree to form a cartel. They collude to restrict the number of flights and keep ticket prices artificially high. They agree to act together like a single monopolist and split the massive $100 million monopoly profit 50-50.
It sounds like a perfect, highly rational plan.
It does. But here is where I push back on the rationality of economic actors. If collusion and forming a cartel maximizes their joint profits, making them both wildly wealthy, why do almost all cartels inevitably fall apart? Aren't these CEOs supposed to be hyper-rational? Why destroy a good thing?
It is exactly because they are hyper-rational that the cartel falls apart. The prisoner's dilemma mathematically proves that individual rationality can directly and catastrophically conflict with collective rationality. Look back at the matrix you just solved. Let's say United honors the agreement and sticks to the high price.
If they stick to the high price, my underline was in the low price row. I have a massive, overwhelming individual incentive to cheat on the agreement. If I secretly discount my tickets, I steal the entire market and bump my profits from $50 million to $80 million.
Okay, but what if United anticipates your betrayal and decides to cheat first by lowering their price?
If United cheats and goes low, my underline was still in the low price row. I must also cheat and lower my price just to survive and make $20 million, otherwise I fly empty and make zero.
Do you see the tragedy? Regardless of what United does, whether they honor the cartel or betray the cartel, your strictly dominant strategy is to cheat. And because the game is symmetrical, United faces the exact same inescapable logic. Their dominant strategy is also to cheat.
So they both betray each other.
They both cheat. The unilateral incentive to undercut the cartel price exerts an inescapable gravitational pull, dragging both firms down into the bottom right box of the matrix, the Nash equilibrium of mutual defection. They both end up earning $20 million, which is significantly worse than the $50 million they would have earned if they had just maintained trust.
Even though joint profit maximization is clearly the best collective outcome, the Nash equilibrium dictates that the cartel will collapse. It is deeply cynical, but mathematically flawless.
Now, if cartels fall apart so easily, what do firms do to stop the bleeding?
They merge. If you can't illegally collude with your rival, you just buy them.
Yeah. Exactly. Mergers. And there are three types you need to know. Horizontal mergers are when two direct competitors merge like two airlines. The goal is to eliminate competition, increase market power, and achieve economies of scale.
Right. Then there are vertical mergers. That's when a firm buys its supplier or distributor, like an automaker buying a tire manufacturer. The goal there is usually reducing transaction costs or securing the supply chain.
And finally, conglomerate mergers. That's when completely unrelated firms merge. A shoe company buying a food processor. That's usually driven by a desire to diversify risk across different markets.
Right, but horizontal mergers are the ones that really worry regulators because they create so much market power. Because private markets so frequently fall into these structural traps, whether it's failing to maintain a cooperative cartel, merging to form a monopoly, or forming a destructive, entrenched natural monopoly where one firm leverages economies of scale to crush everyone else, the public sector eventually has to step in.
They have to. The free market fails to optimize welfare, so the government must regulate the pricing. This leads us into the complexities of public sector pricing and market imperfections.
When a market fails to achieve efficiency, governments intervene. This is especially true in cases of natural monopolies. These are usually public utilities, water distribution networks, the electrical grid, regional railway systems.
A natural monopoly exists when a single firm can supply the entire market demand at a lower average cost than two or more competing firms could. This is usually due to massive, insurmountable, fixed costs, like laying 1 million miles of copper wire or underground water pipes, combined with massive economies of scale.
It makes absolutely no sense to have 3 different water companies digging up the street to lay 3 competing sets of pipes to every house. It's wildly inefficient. So we grant one company a legal monopoly, but in exchange, the government regulates what they can charge. The sources explicitly contrast marginal cost pricing with average cost pricing for these regulators.
Marginal cost pricing is the theoretical ideal of the welfare economist. The government steps in and forces the utility company to set their price exactly equal to their marginal cost of production. As we discussed in perfect competition, this achieves perfect allocative efficiency. Society gets the exact right amount of water or electricity, maximizing total social welfare.
But there is a fatal mathematical flaw with applying this to a natural monopoly, isn't there?
Yes. Remember the cost structure of a natural monopoly. Because of those massive fixed costs, they experience continuously declining average costs over the relevant range of demand. And mathematically, if average cost is continuously falling, the marginal cost curve must lie strictly below the average cost curve.
Right, because the marginal unit is pulling the average down. So what happens if the regulator forces them to use marginal cost pricing?
If the regulator forces the price down to equal marginal cost, That mandated price will physically be lower than the firm's average total cost. The firm will lose money on every single unit it sells. It will operate at a perpetual massive loss and eventually go bankrupt and shut down the power grid.
So forcing perfect efficiency literally causes bankruptcy. The government would have to constantly subsidize the utility with taxpayer money just to keep the lights on. What is the pragmatic alternative?
The second best solution is average cost pricing. The regulator allows the firm to set a price exactly where the market demand curve intersects the firm's average cost curve.
So the firm exactly breaks even. Total revenue equals total cost. They earn a normal profit to keep their investors happy, but zero economic profit.
Exactly. It ensures the financial viability of the utility without requiring a single cent of constant government subsidies. However, because this average cost price is higher than the marginal cost, it intentionally restricts output and does reintroduce a small deadweight loss into the market. It is a necessary, pragmatic compromise between theoretical efficiency and operational reality.
Now, some regulators try a different approach. Rate of return regulation. They tell the utility, we will allow you to charge whatever price guarantees you a fair, specific percentage return, say 8% on your capital investment. It sounds fair, but the notes warn specifically about the Average-Johnson effect. What is the danger here?
Harvey Average and Leland Johnson proved that this regulatory structure creates a perverse incentive. If you guarantee a firm an 8% return strictly based on how much capital they deploy, what will the firm naturally do?
They will deploy as much capital as humanly possible, even if it's completely unnecessary.
Exactly. They will overcapitalize. They will engage in gold plating. They will buy the most expensive, over-engineered transformers, build luxurious headquarters, and replace functional equipment prematurely. They substitute capital for labor, even when labor would be cheaper. It leads to severe productive inefficiency, effectively inflating the rate base to extract more absolute profit from the regulator.
That is a classic unintended consequence of regulation. Now, let's shift to another highly critical pricing concept mentioned in the syllabus, peak load pricing. This is vital for utilities and infrastructure.
Peak load pricing deals with markets where consumer demand fluctuates wildly depending on the time of day or the season. Think of electricity usage, commuter rail transit, or toll roads. But the firm faces a hard, inflexible capacity constraint that cannot be easily or cheaply expanded.
Let's use electricity. The marginal cost of generating electricity at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in October is incredibly low. Demand is almost zero. The utility just burns a tiny bit of cheap coal or natural gas.
But look at 2:00 p.m. on the hottest day of August. Every air conditioner in the city is running at full blast. Demand surges right up against the absolute maximum capacity limit of the entire power grid.
To provide one more single kilowatt of electricity at that specific peak time, the utility can't just burn more coal. They might literally have to build a brand new billion-dollar power plant just to handle that 1 hour of peak demand.
Exactly. Therefore, the short-run marginal cost at the peak is astronomically high because it must include the massive capital cost of that capacity expansion. Peak load pricing theory argues that it is economically inefficient to charge a flat rate all day. You should charge off-peak users only the cheap, low operating fuel costs. But you must charge peak users the much higher price that fully incorporates the capacity costs.
Because the peak users are the ones actively straining the system and forcing the need for new power plants.
Exactly. It prices the scarcity of the capacity.
Wait, I need a clarifying question here because I can hear the listener getting confused. How is peak load pricing any different from the third-degree price discrimination we talked about earlier with the senior citizen pharmacy discounts? Aren't they both just the firm deciding to charge different groups of people different prices at different times?
That is a very common and very dangerous point of confusion on exams. But they are fundamentally theoretically different. Third-degree price discrimination is purely about exploiting different price elasticities of demand to extract maximum monopoly profit. It has absolutely nothing to do with the cost of production. The pill costs the exact same to make whether a senior or a worker buys it.
Right, it's just profit extraction based on willingness to pay.
Peak load pricing, on the other hand, is driven entirely by actual cost differences and rigid capacity constraints. It is an exercise in allocative efficiency. You charge the peak users a higher price not to gouge them, but because the actual marginal cost of providing the service during that specific hour is exponentially higher due to the capacity constraint. One model is designed for profit extraction, the other designed for efficient resource allocation and cost reflection.
That is a brilliant, crucial distinction. Profit extraction versus cost reflection. Before we wrap up this massive theoretical journey, We need to touch briefly on asymmetric information in product markets. This happens when one side of the transaction knows vastly more about the product than the other side.
This brings us to George Akerlof's Nobel Prize-winning paper, The Market for Lemons, examining the used car market. The core problem is that the seller of a used car knows exactly if the car is a high-quality peach or a defective lemon, but the buyer, just looking at it on the lot, cannot tell the difference.
The information is asymmetric, so what happens to the market equilibrium?
Because buyers can't distinguish quality, they refuse to pay the high price that a peach is truly worth. They will only offer an average price reflecting the risk of accidentally buying a lemon. This creates a pooling equilibrium. Both high and low-quality goods are forced to be priced the same.
And because the seller of the pristine, high-quality car can't get a fair price for their vehicle, they refuse to sell it. They withdraw their peach from the market.
Which means the average quality of the cars remaining on the lot drops. So buyers lower their average price offer even further, which drives out the next tier of good cars. The bad relentlessly drives out the good until the entire market completely collapses and only lemons are left.
So how do markets fix this death spiral? How do we achieve a separating equilibrium where good products can command high prices again?
Markets develop market signaling. High-quality sellers take observable, highly costly actions that low-quality sellers simply cannot afford to mimic. For example, the seller of a peach will offer a comprehensive 3-year bumper-to-bumper warranty.
Because they know the car won't break down, the warranty costs them almost nothing to offer.
Exactly. But if the seller of a lemon tried to offer that same warranty, the car would break down immediately and the repair costs would bankrupt them. Therefore, the warranty acts as a perfectly credible signal of quality. It mathematically separates the market back out, solving the information asymmetry without the buyer ever having to look under the hood.
That is a fascinating way to end our theoretical breakdown. Okay, let's look ahead. Based on this exhaustive deep dive into the 2025 questions, the mathematical proofs, and the core theory of value, what are the most likely patterns for the listener facing the upcoming 2026 IES exam? Synthesize this into the top 3 most critical takeaways.
Number 1. Be intensely prepared to calculate a numerical Cournot or Stackelberg equilibrium from scratch. The examiners will likely give you a market demand function and individual cost functions. You must be able to mathematically derive the residual demand, set up the reaction functions, find the intersection, and calculate the exact profit-maximizing quantities and the final market price. Practice the algebra until it's muscle memory.
That's the quantitative hurdle. What's number 2?
Number 2 is conceptual depth. Understand the welfare economics and efficiency arguments for peak load pricing deeply, and be ready to explicitly contrast it with standard third-degree price discrimination, exactly as we discussed. Do not confuse cost reflection with profit extraction.
And the final takeaway.
Number 3, game theory applications. Be able to accurately construct and identify the Nash equilibrium in a 2x2 payoff matrix. But more importantly, be able to apply it conceptually to a prisoner's dilemma context for a duopoly. You must be able to explain the specific unilateral incentives that cause a rational cartel to inevitably collapse into a price war.
That is a rock-solid, actionable roadmap for your revision. We've covered immense ground today. We started in the frictionless, utopian vacuum of perfect competition, waded through the muddy, geometry-heavy waters of monopoly and monopolistic competition, navigated the strategic chessboards of oligopoly, and decoded the Cold War mathematical logic of game theory and regulatory pricing.
It is a vast amount of material, but understanding the behavioral why behind the geometric what is the key to mastering it.
Absolutely. Now, I want to leave you with a final forward-looking thought that builds directly on the strategic interdependence and the prisoner's dilemma we unpacked today. We established that human-run cartels inevitably break down because human CEOs, acting rationally to maximize their own individual bonuses, will eventually succumb to the temptation to cheat.
It's human nature mathematically quantified.
But look at the modern economy. What happens if the massive oligopolies of the future don't use human pricing managers? What if they deploy sophisticated AI pricing algorithms? If these algorithms can learn through billions of rapid-fire micro-iterations to perfectly collude learning to punish defection instantly and solving the prisoner's dilemma to maintain monopoly prices, all without ever explicitly communicating or writing a single illegal contract, will our current economic models of antitrust regulation completely break down? How do you regulate an equilibrium that a machine learned on its own? It's a terrifying evolution of the Cournot model and something profound to ponder as you review your notes. Keep questioning the models and keep diving deep.